And so we're going to start off with the panel just getting 5 minutes each. And I have been told that it's only 5 minutes, so I'm gonna be timing them, and they're gonna answer the questions that we put out as the framework for this talk. Thank you. She went and got you water so that you can just talk forever.
Oh, thank you very much.
That's very nice.
Yeah. So we're the questions that we put out, and they're just gonna talk for 5 minutes each on this are, can we maintain our integrity as scientists while addressing policy issues? And can we maintain our integrity as scientists without addressing policy issues? So with that, I think Gretchen, you can go first.
Oh, is that what you can?
She wants me to go first.
Well,
because Steve is not here.
I was going to go on more general
Okay.
stuff, and then I was going to give a couple specific cases.
The general answer.
No.
Okay.
The general answer. Let's see. The first question was, can we maintain our integrity? The answer is yes. Can we maintain our integrity without addressing policy issues? The answer is no. This has been the subject of long discussion.
Good one, Rochelle. You scared him.
This is the result of a long discussion, but actually this wouldn't be discussed in many venues. For example, it's perfectly all right for a medical scientist to say, smoking is going to kill you, and you got to be really stupid to do it. But it's not perfectly all right for an environmental scientist to say climate change threatens our entire future and we ought to do something about it. So it's largely a matter of the disciplines we're in rather than is there any way to be a pure scientist and not notice that the world's falling apart around you. How do you deal with keeping your integrity in dealing with the public on these issues? I think Steve and I have the same basic rules. Number one, when you're talking about a scientific issue, you first give the scientific consensus. Now, we don't always do this perfectly, but this is the way it ought to be done. Second, if you disagree with the scientific consensus, you then say, I have a heterodox view on this. I think, for instance, I would say, I don't agree with the IPCC because I think they're too conservative and they're somewhat out of date now, and that I'm much more concerned than I was when the last IPCC report comes out, and that a lot of my colleagues feel the same way. That's reporting what knowledgeable people think, but not saying this is the scientific consensus. And then I might go on to say, and I think one of the best solutions to this is put on a heavy carbon tax, take the money from the heavy carbon tax, say in the United States, divide it up equally among the people of the United States. That way, the government isn't getting rich by taxing carbon, but the people who are driving the Hummers are paying a high price, and the people who are biking are getting money back. The second question, and that is what, can you keep your, can you be a real scientist without dealing with these issues? No, how you deal with them is an issue, but it's just like if you were a doctor and you were doing work finding that smoking was giving people lung cancer, and you decided that all you could do is say, my results show that 500 beagles died when they smoked cigarettes, and 500 beagles that didn't smoke cigarettes, which were my control, didn't die, and you got to make your own conclusions out of that. I think that's very irresponsible. It doesn't mean everybody has to be a loudmouth and out on TV or writing lots of articles, but any scientist can find ways to contribute, to, particularly in our area, to bring the results of their science to the general public. And it's frankly just insane to bring your results to the general public and then say, your clock's off. I have actually 60-some seconds left. 67. No, 67.
Shoot.
No, doesn't matter. I'm done. Basically, to not give your opinion on things that you've studied over your entire life and not give the public the benefit of that is just nuts.
Okay. I thought I'd follow on that with just a couple of more concrete experiences to illustrate where some tension has come up for me. And I'd love to hear, get kind of into some of the concrete cases and just sort of share thoughts and experience and how to address these things. Because I imagine many of us are pretty like-minded or we wouldn't have come to this room. And I imagine we're all working in different ways. And I'd highlight, the only thing I'll say on that second question is that, so many people apply to spend our lives in this kind of weird track that I remember my parents thought when I said I was going to go for a PhD that it was sort of a one-year program and that was it. Had no idea what all was involved, but we do it because we care, and such. And I think there are many, many ways to contribute to, society, and I think we ought to, we do value all these different ways. So without getting into that further, I'll give the two concrete cases. The first, really briefly, is that I was working with many people, Chan and some others in the room, on biodiversity change. And the thing that surprised us, it happened in one year, Paul was there as well, we set up this experiment to look at, in tropical rainforest landscapes, how biodiversity was likely to sort of change in coming decades and stuff. And we ended up setting up this experiment that killer bees came to, and it freaked us out and everybody else out. We had to take the thing down. We'd spent some weeks setting it up, and it left me there at this remote field site with nothing to do. And that led me to turn to kind of the open, cleared agricultural landscapes. And it was incredible to have my eyes open to something that I think many of the locals were well aware of, and many tropical scientists were aware of, but that there is tremendous biodiversity, however you measure it, in many, many farming landscapes across the tropics. So it's led to what's now kind of maybe a 15-year research program on this. And initially, when we started finding such high diversity, I was worried, and colleagues here were worried that I not come out strongly saying, actually, deforestation is not the problem, that it's claimed to be, that we not fuel some of the very unproductive debate going on, led by people like Bjorn Lomborg, who were really far at the other extreme. So I actually held off in publicizing the results. We published the results, and we waited until we really felt confident that what we were finding did hold up. And so we waited some years, and it was only kind of recently with a paper that Jai Ranganathan, who was here until very recently, he's a postdoc at Santa Barbara now, he published on what's going on in India. That got covered by The Economist and many other media outlets this past November. But prior to that, we decided just to hold off and be really confident that we weren't being overly optimistic in what we were finding. The second area, and I'll mention it more briefly, and we can get into it if people want, concerns modeling the future provision of ecosystem services or benefits to society. And it's a really complex area. And just to say, so in all of it, I'm every day sort of coming up against these different possible courses and how to convey what we're learning. And it's something where I've never gotten into, thank you, a really tough situation apart from in giving a lecture up at Berkeley. So what we're trying to do is, I'll tell you about that briefly, is we're trying to align economic forces with conservation broadly. But there's all these questions, well, what are you trying to conserve? There are trade-offs inherent in everything. So our approach is to use modeling that's essentially neutral. It just lays out what you would think based on biophysical processes will result from alternative choices or courses of action. But in anything you do, and what was brought up in Berkeley by some people who surprised me, it just shows I was a bit naive, was saying, they're sort of saying, how do you know you're not doing harm? And the basic thrust of the argument was, if you don't know, if you can't guarantee you're doing no harm, somehow, and harm was defined in a very diffuse way, you shouldn't do anything. And I do differ with that and feel, and come back to Paul's point and how it would be in medicine and any other field. I think that you have to go with your best judgment, and I think be very candid about what you know and what you don't know, what the uncertainties are, and hopefully really frame uncertainties in a productive way. But I feel the negligence would come more if we shy away from communicating or, quote, doing anything because we fear taking a misstep. So time's up, and just in time we have Steve Schneider here. We've each gone for 5, and she's going to wave those flags at you, and then the really dire consequences set in if you go over
I don't
the
get
bar.
chocolate?
Do you want to hear the questions?
Yeah, why don't you give me
Yeah.
the questions?
Well, you
again?
get the chocolates, so yours.
All right, the questions are, can we maintain our integrity as scientists while addressing policy issues? And can we maintain our integrity as scientists without addressing policy issues?
Well, the answer to both those questions are very easy, yes and no. Because it depends how you do it. And I love to give talk, which I do to the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program Fellows, as Gretchen has suffered through that. And Paul and I do camera work. We're reporters who interview people. We're not nice. And the talk is called, Is the Scientist Advocate an Oxymoron? How many people think it is? Nobody? You're afraid I'll call on you. John, come on. I've never seen you shy about anything. What?
I was a little scratching my
Oh, is that it? Yeah.
It was probably psychological.
How many think it's not? Oh, we're not going to get anywhere. All right, of course it's the same answer. Depends how you do it. So we have what I call double ethical bind. On the one hand, we're scientists. Full disclosure, whole truth, nothing but the truth, all the caveats. When you write papers, you start with your caveats and you end up somewhat shyly at the back, apologetically, with recommendations and conclusions, unless you're Paul. And he doesn't bury his lead. And I don't usually either, but you have to know the culture of the journal. So that's very typical for us. How about journalists? They start with the recommendation, and then they get down to caveats last, and they hope the editor doesn't snip it out before they get to the caveats. Otherwise, the scientists they spoke to are going to be very mad at them because they're going to look dumb in front of their colleagues. It's just part of the game. So we have very different cultures. The culture of advocacy is what I call courtroom epistemology. It's not my job to win my opponent's case. So as a result of that, it is perfectly okay. In fact, it would be unethical not to be selective in evidence to try to defend the client. In our epistemology and ideology, doing that is unethical. So if you're out there in the real world, you'd better understand the way the advocacy world sees things. Because when we talk about policy, they're going to impute to us that we're just the same as they are. We must be spinning because they're spinning. And that's a risk, and it's a legitimate risk. So what I try to do is I try in 2 minutes to make people understand that how to react to a range of risk. What is risk? Probability times consequence. That's objective, non-normative mostly, because what you choose to study is, by the way, weakly normative. There's no way to avoid value judgments at some stage. So when we say we're objective, all we can ever be is a little more objective. And that's an okay thing to strive for. So when you're out there, you make these judgments, you talk about these things, and you try to frame them in the caveats. You come up with a conclusion, and that conclusion might very well get somebody on the other side to say you're spinning. But we're not, because risk, probability times consequence, that's where I was, I lost my train. This happened increasingly over 60. Well, he's the expert. The question on that is, lost it again, no. How do you do that? That's scientific. What can happen, what are the odds? But what the society should do about it is risk management, not risk, that's value judgment about how you take a society with limited resources and invest in a whole range of alternatives when there are trade-offs. So I think that those scientists who come clean and admit that they know that there are trade-offs and that nonetheless they still have a position where they feel that the planet shouldn't take that risk, that's fine with me. Just admit your worldview. When somebody says to me, and I'm asked this question in Congress all the time, Senator says, don't worry, it's not enough. A good senator says, an honest senator says, well, you're a smart guy. Well, what would you do? And I say, thank you, Senator, for making me a senator for a day. I'm sure I could do it more than a day. You know, they laugh. They like that kind of humor. And then I'll say, you asked me for a personal value judgment. So before I'll give you the answer, and I hope I'll be articulate and convince you, I got to tell you what my worldview is. And my worldview is if a problem is created by a few people who benefit and then it hurts a lot of people who don't, like greenhouse emissions that made the rich richer and then hurt the poor that can't adapt, and if the problem threatens irreversibility like extinction or melted ice sheet, that gets special bump for me. And I put that above some other things that you have to trade it off against. Once I've given the worldview, I'm going to try to articulately explain it. So I don't see it as an oxymoron, but you have to always come clean on the values and separate out risk from risk management. Sorry for the extra minute.
Quite all right.
Half minute.
Thank you.
30 seconds, that's
Yeah,
pretty
it
good.
was pretty good.
A new record, in fact.
I
Is
knew, he'd
Guinness
get,
here?
I knew he'd get even.
All right, so since they were so awesome and stuck to 5 minutes, we do have a lot of time for discussion. So that's the main point, is to hear from you guys. And I met with Deb Rogers, and we sort of made up a little agenda for the discussion. So as you see up here, we're just going to have audience questions from you for most of the time. And then at the end, if you have any experiences that you want to share, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes, that don't necessarily have a question, but just something you feel compelled to say, there'll be space for that. And then at the very end, as I said, we're going to have a few minutes to talk about the future of the session. And I'm going to take moderator's privilege, I think, and ask the first question, which is a question that Deb and I came up with. So kind of making sure that we are thinking holistically about this discussion and about this point of advocacy in science, thinking about the critiques of this viewpoint and explicitly addressing some of those critiques. And I'm sure there are more, which hopefully will come up at some time. But two of the critiques we thought of were from very different audiences. So one coming from the academic and scientific audience, that it's been hinted at, Steve talked about it, but that this is eroding your objectivity, and that once you enter the political discourse and the political sphere, you're no longer objective, and all of the science that you produce is tainted by that viewpoint. So responses to that, and then another critique from maybe grassroots activist, more that line of work or interest, that the way that we are communicating as scientists isn't effective. That we get out there, we try to communicate a message, but we're not doing so effectively, and the message just isn't getting there. So those are two issues. You don't all have to respond, obviously, to every question. So if you want to address either of those things, any of you, I open that up.
I'll say on the first one, while he's swallowing, he was saying real risk. I do think it's easy to slide into a feeling that you understand things better than you actually do. And so I think to address that, it's important to take advantage of our context in academia, to always be out there testing yourself. I see it a little bit like in athletics, where those who are really active in an academic discipline, you're always, it's kind of a competitive thing. You're competing for journal space, you're competing with your ideas and stuff. And while I don't normally think of it just in this competitive sense, I see that as a great asset, actually. And even with my sort of crazy schedule now and trying to be at home more with the kids and stuff, I sign myself up to go off and give talks specifically at universities. Occasionally, I'm going on one next week, just to have people attack me. So the Berkeley one is in my mind, because you go and you lay out your ideas, and then there's typically a day or two where people, one after the other, are just trying to pick apart your ideas, not normally in an unfriendly way. It can be really fun, but it challenges you and makes you reconsider. And so I see that as one real beauty and advantage in terms of remaining a little more objective than, human beings are never, quote, perfectly objective in any way than we would be otherwise, and just aware.
I find this is the easiest problem for me, and that is, I think the critical thing is that you, for example, if I have an idea about climate change, I send it to Steve and Kirk Smith and a couple of other people and see what they think. In other words, I think what George Will and Rush Limbaugh, I think, means absolutely nothing to me, and is typical of scientists. Scientists live by the values of their peers, and anything that Ann and I do in the public arena has normally been not only screened by a lot of people in that form, but also based on stuff that we've published or that other people have published in the peer-reviewed literature. So sure, it's always, I'm not totally I'm not even partly objective. That may not be the issue, but what science is an adversarial game, and therefore what makes us more objective is not that we're different kinds of human beings, but that we have people out there, as Gretchen indicated, who would just absolutely love So anytime anybody says to me, don't you believe in evolution? I say, hell no. You know, I don't believe in anything. If I could show tomorrow that Darwin was dead wrong, the manuscript would be going off to science right now. And I think that's a very good attitude for scientists to have.
Yeah, let me distinguish between a skeptic and a denier. We're all skeptics. If we're not skeptics, we're not very good scientists. We're constantly trying to find improvements in our understanding. But when you spend an awfully long time and you decide that if I pick this up and drop it, it's going to drop, I don't think we have to spend a whole lot of time on gravity now. It becomes well established unless you're into some subtleties in physics. And so you move on and you accept that, and what you do is you move into the components where there's much less that we understand, and we concentrate there. I love when I do popular talks. I always ask my audience. So this is a question I'm asked by media and members of Congress and everybody who does it, business leaders, and it's absolutely true. Do you really believe that we should act? That is the science of global warming settled? So I do an audience quiz. I'll do it here. Some of you have seen this. So how many think the science of global warming is settled?
Good bunch of scientists, actually.
How many think it's not settled? How many think it's a stupid question? Exactly. Because what we're really talking about is we're talking about complex system science, which, unlike falsification that the chemist would say, I have a theory, this is an acid, I try it. Not good enough. Get me the litmus paper. Falsify a bad hypothesis or support it. When you're talking about ecosystems, details of evolution, conservation finance, climate change, it's system science. So many components, you don't even know whether the data are facts because you don't know if they're collected right. So what you end up with is a component that's well established, a component that's competing explanations, and a component that's speculative. It's fraudulent to point to a component that's speculative and say, therefore, it isn't proven, we can't do anything. That is what you run into all the time out there. And as soon as you tell them, I'm not arguing that that component is not there, I'm telling you that there's a preponderance of evidence, and that's the basis for decisions. How many think that tobacco smoking causes cancer? How many of you can tell us the mechanism biologically whereby the smoke causes cancer? Nobody. You know what they say? It's not proven, can't do it, because it's proven beyond a doubt on the basis of the empirical evidence, even though that component is not in. So you've got to always be setting those aside. Now, you cannot count on them being quoted, and there are some risks out there when you do this. You just play the game as straight as you can play it, and you know the funny thing is your colleagues will know whether you're fair and reasonable. Paul said is absolutely right. You got to run it by your colleagues, and if you think you're doing the best job you can, it's not risk-free, but it's better than just winging it out of your head. You can't not have a personal emotional attachment to many things. And it's one of the areas I get mad at two groups of people. The postmodernists who think that because science has elements of social construction and personal belief, therefore it's no different than any other epistemology, which is sheer nonsense, because they're not evidence-based, and peer-based the way we are. And scientists who say that all real science is objective because we have unconscious prejudices, such as we like the species, we like the model, we like the group. And that's the whole reason what Paul said. You've got to run it by people. I define my friends as the ones when I send them my draft who put a Z, right, Zorro, on your chest in advance without killing you, rather than smile at you and then after it's published put a knife in your back. So you've got to trust people, and then you have to do for them what they did for you. You've got to be a really good critic. You have to show them where they are a little out of line because they're unconsciously prejudiced, and that's going to come back and hurt them. But when you talk about, and somebody says you love birds, even if you did, you say yes, but that doesn't affect my data. And I love to show polar bears. And I start out with this cartoon of the poor polar bear, and then I have this great picture some of you have seen where there's this mother polar bear, very nicely and gently caressing the cub. And I'll say, how many of you have seen polar bears? And very, very few in the audience. I said, so isn't it cute? And they go, and I said, and if you went over and you went, nice bear, you know what you'd be? you'd be a Darwin Award winner. We don't want the polar bears here because they're cuddly. We want them here because they're here. Because they're, part of millions of years of the coevolution of climate and life, and it's a strongly held value. Try to turn it around when they do that. Pick a system where you say, I admit, I don't want to be anywhere near that bear except on the other side of glass. You've seen polar bears, and every time you've been out there, they had...
One tried to eat me once, so I have a very strong emotional feeling about polar bears.
Right. Yet he fights to keep them. I mean, what, you have a rifle? You didn't, you'd be
No,
an
I
idiot.
ran like hell.
Oh, you out
He had Adidas.
Adidas.
No, his friend had only Nike.
What did he do?
I still have
What he did is he tripped his friend while they were running, so the bear got to them.
Correct placement.
But you got to, have a little humor when you do these things. Have these sort of series of metaphors. This just doesn't pop in your head. Not everybody has, these guys' synapses. So you rehearse. If you think you're going to get out there, think about answers to questions like that. Use your colleagues. It really can help.
The classic, I gotta finish the bear story. The classic bear story is the bear's chasing you, and you get to a tree, and you start running around the tree, and the bear is chasing you, and the bear slips back, and then you get a little further ahead, and then you slip back, and then you slip back again, but the bear slips back, and somebody says, well, weren't you really scared? And he said, what do you think the bear was slipping on?
I don't know about that humor, but
Another
It's good in here.
on-camera faux pas, nicely illustrated. I'll give a quick reaction, but I want to go on. There are two questions here. I just say I do have a real emotional connection with a lot of dimensions to my work. And so I try to separate that from my analysis and how at some level, and I don't want to take too much of the time, but I wouldn't say I'm the way you characterized yourself, so we're going to have a lunch over that.
Kate-
That's interesting.
Wishes.
Yeah.
Kate's had her hand up.
So John Tierney had a sort of interesting article yesterday in the Science Times about...
Who invited her?
She's her father's
he would
daughter.
get something obnoxious from me. Great.
It's true.
But basically, he was talking about activist, non-honest science in politics and in the White House. And I think in some ways you addressed this when you talked about risk analysis versus risk management. But I was wondering if you would comment as a group on the difference between identifying problems and making sure that's out there, like climate change is a big deal, we should do something about this, and advocating for specific kinds of solutions, something that's very normative. So the example that Tierney used was, everybody goes on and on about reducing emissions, but why does nobody talk about future sequestration? Maybe that's something we should be.
Well, but that's a typical Tierney statement, since there's a huge literature and much talk on future sequestration. I mean,
Yeah.
and there are whole bunches of scientists who would love to do that because that is where their expertise lies.
But I think that his point stands, which is that there is a big difference between identifying an issue and standing behind it scientifically and advocating for a specific kind of solution. And I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Well, as the veteran Tierney expert,
Yeah, now you
he's
gotta remember
probably
that
had
John.
you as the happy subject in most of his comments.
Gretchen and I tried to teach
And
him some ecology one summer, many years ago. And I caught a butterfly, and he said, "Can I hear it screaming?" He's famous for the room temperature IQ, but the basic point is, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a scientist saying, I think the best solution to this problem would be sequestering the CO2. Here's the mechanisms I would recommend. I think we could do this. My cost estimate would be that. And some other scientists can say, I think that's crazy, that actually we can reduce emissions with the following kinds of trap, cap, and trade, or carbon things. So it's going to be simpler and so on, and scientists will disagree on that, but it's crystal clear where they're coming from. In other words, what would you do otherwise? How would you come to any kind of solution except to have people who have studied it, know the mechanisms, know the science, to get together and to get separately and discuss and debate what should happen. And this goes on all the time. All you've got to do is look at the history of nuclear power, which is being continued right this very day. And you'll find scientists with very different views, but it's clear where they're coming from.
Maybe a further point is just to distinguish those problems for which not that much technical expertise is required to assess the relative merits of the alternatives, or at least dimensions of those, whereas there are other cases where you really have to be expert to know, what the trade-offs are going to be. I'd say within the Natural Capital Project, where we're trying to forecast changes in ecosystem service provision, broadly defined in the context of different policy decisions around the world. The people on the natural capital team are not, we're involved in setting up the scenarios or the choices so much. We're thinking of getting more involved in that, just because a lot of the contexts in which we start working involve people who are new at thinking about what the scenarios might even look like. But we're trying to take an approach where it's the decision makers, where you get a diverse group of people, ideally representing, it just depends on the context, but a diverse range of people defining things themselves, and typically we've been invited in. So it's more a matter of then just sort of responding to their questions and needs, and then kind of iterating from there after you conduct some analysis. Often it opens up things that hadn't been properly explored from a scientific point of view in the first round that you can then get into more deeply. But the main aim is not really to be laying out our own values. It's more to provide a tool and a forum for debating the alternatives from different social points of view, economic and other.
Yeah, so first, let me very briefly deconstruct the framing of your question and then answer it, because it's a good question. The problem with framing it with Tierney, you could have said Inhofe, you could have said George Will, Charles Krauthammer, Rush Limbaugh, is these guys set up so many straw men that there's enough straw there to fill a feedlot and keep 1,000 animals going for a long time. When he says, why aren't they talking about carbon capture and sequestration? If he doesn't know that, he has no business talking about the topic. It is every talk I ever give that's in there, not just from me, but from the audience. And so this is the standard polemic. You set up a straw man, which everybody reading it who's not familiar with the topic would say, wow, that's unreasonable. Those guys must be unreasonable, when that's not what they're doing. So that having been said, there is still, we can't duck the question, which is, so how do you deal with the positive normative trade-off, what I like to call double ethical bind, the obligation to full disclosure, and at the same time, to be effective, you have to work through the sound bites. I think that the way you do that is you have a hierarchy of backup products. You have an op-ed, 4 sound bites. You write a Scientific American article, 20 minutes worth. You have a large website and whole books where you can then give the full disclosure. So you've done due diligence so that whoever wants it can get it. But for you to say, because I don't have time in the soundbite framework of journalism to be able to give, or in front of Congress where you get 5 minutes, to be able to give the whole story, therefore it's unscientific and I won't play, and it'll involve normative judgments, I don't view that as a higher calling. I view that as passing the buck. Because who are you passing the buck on to? Probably people who know less about it than you do. So it's coming back again. When you're involved in a normative realm, you just say what your worldviews are. And you separate them out, you separate risk and risk management, and make it explicit, because they don't always get it. That's the best you can do. But it is absolutely right that they will impute to you that if they're spinning, you're spinning. And it's very difficult to overcome it. It is not a risk-free venture to do that. All you have to do is make sure you do it in a way that you're satisfied that the bulk of your peers think that you are honest in how you presented risks. That's the best you can do. Liars and spin doctors assume everybody's a liar and spin doctor. There's not much you can do except make fun of them.
How do you then kind of defend, yes, you can have these nested models where your soundbite says such and such, and you have an op-ed, you have a Scientific American piece, but Joe the plumber doesn't read Scientific American or the New York Times for op-eds, right? Joe the plumber watches Rush Limbaugh, and if you get a Rush Limbaugh quote, right, you still want that to have some impact, because people need to get on board for some of these things. So how do you, kind of balance these kind of opposing things where hyperbole is very useful sometimes, but on the other hand, if you just said, well, here is the spectrum of what may happen, nobody's gonna do anything.
You do the best you can. In other words, this is something we all face all the time. Just up there, somebody's asking you a question, and the issue is how far out of the probability distribution do you want to go and emphasize? But you got to be as careful as you possibly can. I mean, John Holdren was attacked for saying he thought it was possible that by the year 2010 or 2020, I don't remember which, that as many as 1 billion people could die because of climate change. Now, on the order of right now, about 10 million people starve to death annually. We are permanently changing the, not permanently, we are changing the, if you believe people like Steve, the pattern of rainfall over the planet for maybe the next 1,000 years. Nobody knows exactly what will happen, but we have 1 billion people hungry right now. So that's not an absurd statement. I don't think he'd make it again today, particularly in the position he's in. But it brings home what the possible consequences could be. And in fact, if you add in the fact that these things might trigger a small nuclear war or even a large nuclear war or something, so you are always balanced between trying to say something. You've often heard the "I want a single-handed scientist" statement that comes out. So when you're on a TV for they're going to pick one thing out for a 10-second spot, you try and go in between somehow, not to be too absurd, but make it strong enough so people understand what some of the possible consequences are.
So I want to be quick just to make sure we have 2 more questions. So if
Let
you,
me very fast and say, you can frame it probabilistically. I do. And I've actually gotten a lot of environmental groups very angry at me because they said, would you stop with the numerology? I don't want to hear we have 10 years left to solve the problem. That was true in 1979. You know, it's a false frame. Or that 2 degrees is the threshold of dangerous. It's already dangerous depending where you are. It just gets more dangerous. And then at 2.1, the world isn't ended. We can go up to 3 and the world will still be here, but a lot of species won't. You know, so it's a matter of that. And so what I'll say is when somebody says, well, what's the tipping point at which Greenland ice sheet is going to melt? And the enviros have picked 1 degree. Well, I wouldn't rule out at the 5% chance it's already too late, that the meltwater that's going down has carried enough heat that in 50 years we'll figure that out. 1 degree, 25% chance. 2 degrees, 55% chance. 3 degrees, 90%. It's nonlinear upward slope. That's all we know. You can tell that. It's a crap game with loaded dice. People can understand those metaphors, and I think that's how we ought to try to explain it. I don't like it when the enviros frame it the way I just told you, because I got to fix it, because that to me is not the truth. And the truth is, it's a probability density function that we will learn, unfortunately, by experience on laboratory Earth. So you try to use that as a metaphor. There are a lot of ways that you can use metaphors that will get you on the air without having to explicitly take something and then say it's going to happen. That's just a perfect way to give your enemies ammunition to damn your credibility.
so I want to make sure we don't have too much time. So Amy and then Deb. And do we have other people who have questions they want to be asking, just to figure out how much time? Okay. Gretchen, do you want to respond to that?
Go ahead, I will later when I have a chance.
So I was just going to ask, impartial responses to anything. You were actually called out by name, Paul. In
Oh yeah, very frequently. I've
Yeah.
known John
He's the
Tierney for
expert.
a long time.
And so my question is, how do you decide when it's worth it to engage your critics?
Well, with Steve and I have talked about this probably more than almost anything else, because we decided a long time ago on what the general strategies, which I described before he came in, whereas I agree with everything he said. I mean, the trouble with what he just said is often it's a 10-second soundbite, but I totally agree that you got to get the probability in. There is a chance that it is not impossible that, or something like that, to cover your butt. But on the response, we've pretty much come to the conclusion that you don't debate. You can sometimes respond. For instance, particularly we're going to bind right now because John Holdren is being attacked by a lot of these columns. And the issue that we've actually discussed in the emails is, should anybody respond? Who should respond? Fortunately, there have actually been unsolicited responses, but the trouble is, you see, John's up there on a stump. He's not yet confirmed. And the more time that this is occupied, the more time it gives somebody like Imhoff or somebody to get a bright idea of how he might actually shoot him down. So it's a very delicate dance, but I think all of us agree that you don't go in somewhere and debate Rush Limbaugh. That indicates that you think Rush Limbaugh knows as much about climate change as Steve Schneider, if Steve goes to debate him. And you can see the results, because when the people have debated, it goes on their websites. A very classic example was Lombard being invited to Harvard, thanks to the then president of Harvard, Larry Summers, and he now is somebody who has been invited to debate at Harvard, and that really, he got wiped out in the debate, but that doesn't make
It's
no
not his
sense.
website.
Yeah.
But I
Didn't
mean,
put
this
the
is the New York
transcript.
Times that this is published
The
in,
New
so
York
is
Times
that
got us
worth
into
it?
Iraq, remember?
Sure, but it is still a mainstream media source, and so is it
I'd
worth
say
it
the
to
lesson,
debate
though,
that?
it was
or-
really painfully learned. Having sort of been a student here through the Julian Simon days, I don't know if you guys have looked him up, but it was awful to see. People did respond a lot more initially in lots of different ways, and it greatly elevated the stature of people who otherwise would have had no stature, because the game, it's not like the game we play in academia, which is one kind of playing a sport. It's a very different kind of street fight for which academics often aren't tooled up to do well, and so it's a tough judgment call, but I've certainly seen over the years many horrible consequences from engaging.
I mean, Simon's still all over us, and he's been dead for 10 years. I mean, literally, I deal with him, and John Hart deal with him, and Steve today.
Let me give you an example where you do deal. You're in Congress, you're talking, you get Vitter, Rohrbacher, Sensenbrenner. I mean, you know, we have a lot of names to these guys. And they're gonna ask a question. Now, you know there's no conceivable way you can convince them it's a polemic and they're trying to trap you, and you know you're smarter than they are and faster. So, and funnier. So you've got to use all of those things, and the object is not to defeat them. The object is to reach their colleagues who are neutral. And in that case, without answering every specific, you show why you're reasonable and they're not reasonable, without actually attacking the guy. Well, that's an interesting question, Congressman, and let's unpack that, and we go through it. That's a place to do it. You're asked a question when you're giving a talk. Well, you can't just say, listen, idiot, nobody smart would ask me that question. Even though that's what you're thinking, you don't say that, and then you turn, basically throw somebody, it's the old judo story. You watch the little 120-pound guy throwing 200-pound people around, because they're so quick, they throw them in the direction they're already going. And that's what you have to do. You have to use some unreasonable component of their comment, and then you just show that they're ridiculous. It's kind of politely funny, you know, that kind of stuff. That's when you engage. What you don't do is, if they invite you to go do a debate, and it's going to be in there, this is going to not only be on the website, it's going to elevate their book sales, and let somebody else do that. I'm not going to do it. I did it once or twice, and it was a big mistake.
Who was the other person?
Deb.
My question might be too long, but I'll just throw it out there, maybe. we can
Unlike our
talk about
answers.
it at some other point. I mean, the answer to my question might take too long. So assuming that we've decided that it's not only ethical as scientists to be involved in these things, but it's also arguably not ethical to take a pass on it, then there's a third question, which I don't think has been quite asked yet, and that is, what are your objectives and what are your metrics for assessing whether or not you're attaining those objectives? One of the criticisms that I've often heard during my actually fairly lengthy experience in being involved in public issues is that scientists are often very ineffective, that they not only don't know how to talk or explain things in a way that people can relate to, but aren't good about knowing the process and the political process and when to engage and when to back off, and some of the things you're talking about right now, which, by the way, I completely agree with. But what are the objectives and what are the metrics for
I
assessing
would
whether
say
you're
this would
meeting
be
them?
an excellent topic for another
Yeah.
discussion, basically, because it's a big topic.
Yeah.
And then another big topic related to this is how, if you go into academia or other places, you protect yourself from the people who may be senior to you in a department that won't like you by doing these things. But I think what you said is correct. If we really do justice to that, we ought to have another meeting too, to talk about those very issues or those kinds of issues, because it is.
One thing I wanted to throw out, so not to divert from that, but just to get it out before we close, and sort of in response to Naupaka's question, it's that sitting like with these two guys here, looking at the interactions you can have through the media can be terrifying, and it does all seem like you're out on these extremes, and where you're really torn as to what you should do and stuff. And yet, then I look at Chan, who every week sends us newspaper and magazine articles in 12 languages that have been written up on the birds he loves, but doesn't admit to loving, and that you can get a lot of play out there. Think more broadly about the kinds of people that David Attenborough, or I don't know. There are a lot of kinds of people who make it in a big way as communicators of science or other important things in the realm we're talking about, and it's not all in this really dire adversarial kind of context. So I think just as we were saying in response to Rochelle's and Deb's second question, there are a lot of approaches that can be taken in all this, and I'm sure Chan would be happy to duke it out with people, but in general, the sort of coverage and issues he's bringing up aren't, so politically charged.
I'll give you a soundbite answer to both questions. Objectives is going to be utter cliche. We're here to tell the relative truth. I didn't say absolute because I don't know what it is. And that means to sort out the relative confidence that we have in conclusions. And the answer to the metrics, see who it is who's calling you up and asking you to talk more and write articles. See how credible they are. Back in 1974, it's not a soundbite, short story, when 30-year-old John Holder and 20-year-old yours truly were at a meeting that Margaret Mead ran, fighting like crazy with Jim Lovelock and other people about environmental regulations and so forth. They were against them. We were for them. I was very frustrated and expressed it to Margaret Mead, whose meeting this was. And she said, hey, kiddo, you're going to be a skyrocket. You're going to burn out if you're going to worry from day to day. Your ideas move at the speed of transportation. They're around everywhere. But you're talking about cultural change. Cultural change takes 1 to 2 generations. You better have if you're not in it for the long view and you don't have a thick skin, you're in deep trouble. So I think the best metric, listen to your colleagues, see how they think are, and expect it to take a long time. Actually, 2 generations is about right. We're getting there. We're on track.
When I was gonna just throw out, following again on Naupaka's thing and also Noah's and others, is just maybe a dimension to add to one of the discussions, is the ways in which one can contribute as an individual and ways in which one can contribute collectively. And how do you organize? It falls on Deb's thing really, actually. What goals do you establish and how do you measure progress and all that? It's one thing to work as an individual scientist, and it's quite another thing to try and come together in what if some of these efforts have turned into huge global things, and there's a whole lot that we could get into, I think, in exploring how to start teaming up with colleagues and either joining these bigger efforts or starting something new on your own.
Just 2 brief comments on your point. Not only do we have to be trained to understand the context into which the information comes out, but very, very few scientists get a PhD, have a clue about scientific epistemology. I view this as an egregious failure. They used to, years and years ago, make us take 2 languages in order to have a doctor of philosophy. What a bunch of junk. We should have been taking philosophy of science. And we still should, because I find out there were many, many scientists who have no idea whether they're being normative, positive. They don't recognize their own unconscious biases, and therefore they become targets, even when they're being honest and don't know it, for implicit prejudice. So I think that's one of the things that we could talk about. And then the other one, when you were saying that you can get attacked by corporate or other interests, you don't even have to be an advocate. I have colleagues like Ben Santer, who has never advocated any climate policy in his life, and he was the subject of scurrilous personal attacks because he discovered science that was deeply hurting the fossil fuel industry. So they made up stuff about him, and they put it in the Wall Street Journal with those lying fools on the editorial page actually put it out there even though it was libelous and other stuff, because it had some element of the way it was written,
Well, that's
truth.
exactly what happened
That's
to me.
exactly
I
what
had
these
no
guys
position on
do.
it, you know.
So you,
Don't expect to be accurately quoted. I'll tell you
it's
that.
just,
Nobody
if,
quoted invented, you know. nobody
if you're
invented.
hurting
It's
them,
invented.
remember, they're,
Yeah.
they're in the legal
Right.
advocacy
What?
world. Not my job to make my opponent's case. Any way to attack them, go for it. Public's too lazy and ignorant to look it up. So what you need is allies. You've got to
That's
get
right.
other people on your side, and you have to counterattack and make them look greedy, because they don't like that. And you have to blunt it. But that's if you want to play that game. It's a mess out there.
If the graduates